"Stop the launch. Somebody stop the launch. The numbers are wrong, and the only person who knows it is the woman with the mop." That was the sentence a young engineer would scream across mission control one cold morning in February. 40 people would freeze. A billion-dollar spacecraft would hang in the balance. And every single one of them would turn to look for a woman whose name none of them had ever bothered to learn. But to understand how a janitor came to hold the fate of a NASA mission in her tired hands, you have to go back. Back before the shouting. Back before the silence that followed. Back to a woman named Della Mcorreaux, 46 years old, who pushed a cleaning cart down the long gray hallways of the 9th floor, every night, while the rest of the country slept. This is her story, and by the end of it, you may never look at a person holding a broom the same way again. The building never truly slept, but at 2 in the morning it came close. Della Mcorreaux liked the quiet hours best. The phones stopped ringing. The young engineers with their bright lanyards and their loud opinions had gone home to their families. The great glass-walled rooms, the ones with the enormous screens and the rows of monitors that glowed like a city seen from an airplane window, stood empty and humming. And in that hum, in that stillness, a woman pushing a cleaning cart could almost imagine that all of it belonged to her. She knew the building the way a sea captain knows his ship. She knew which floor tiles squeaked and which doors stuck in the damp months. She knew that the coffee machine on the 7th floor made a sound like a dying tractor, and that the one on the 9th floor made no sound at all, which was why she filled her thermos there. She knew the security guards by name: Earl, who showed her pictures of his grandbabies, and Patrice, who was studying for a nursing exam and sometimes asked Della to quiz her during the long dead hours of the night. What none of them knew, not Earl, not Patrice, not a single soul in that towering building full of the smartest people in the country, was that Della Mcorreaux understood the numbers on those great glowing screens better than most of the people paid to read them. She never told anyone. Why would she? A woman does not walk into a room full of doctorates and announce that she once sat in a classroom not so different from theirs. A woman does not point at the equations scrolling across a monitor and say, "I know what that is. I know what that means. I used to dream in that language." People do not believe such things, and Della had learned, a long time ago, that the fastest way to be made a fool of was to ask the world to see you as more than the uniform you wore. So she kept it to herself. She kept it the way some people keep a photograph in a locket, close to the heart, hidden under the cloth, taken out only in private. But oh, she took it out. Every single night. She would finish wiping down the long conference tables, empty the bins, run the soft cloth over the glass until it showed no fingerprints. And then, when the floor was clean and her work was done and there was no one to see, she would stop in front of the great central screen on the 9th floor, the one that displayed the live tracking data for the mission that the whole world was watching. And she would read. She read the way a starving woman eats. She read the orbital tables and the trajectory plots and the long columns of correction values. She read the burn schedules and the gravitational adjustments and the tiny notations the engineers left for one another at the ends of their shifts. And in the reading, 20 years fell away from her shoulders, and she was no longer a woman with a mop and a sore back and a son to feed. She was Della again, just Della, the girl who had once been told she had the finest mind her professor had seen in 30 years of teaching. To understand the woman, you must understand the girl. Della grew up in a small house on a street where the porches sagged and the dreams stayed small because the world had taught everyone there to keep them that way. Her mother cleaned houses. Her father had left when she was 4, and she remembered him only as a coat by the door and a voice she could no longer hear in her memory. But Della had a gift, and it announced itself early. She was the child who took apart the radio to see what made the voices come out, and then, to her mother's astonishment, put it back together so it worked better than before. She was the child who looked up at the night sky from the back steps and asked questions that no one in her family could answer. Why does the moon follow the car? How far away is that star? What's holding all of it up? There was a teacher, a Mrs. Pearline Hadley, who saw something in the girl and refused to let it go to waste. Mrs. Hadley stayed after school. Mrs. Hadley found the books. Mrs. Hadley drove Della in a rattling old car 2 hours each way to a regional science competition and sat in the back of the auditorium and wept when the girl from the sagging porch street stood at the podium and explained the orbit of a comet to a panel of judges who had expected far less. "You are going to do something," Mrs. Hadley told her, gripping both of Della's hands in the parking lot afterward. "You are going to do something this world has never seen. Don't you let anyone tell you otherwise. Not anyone. Not ever." And for a while, it looked as though Mrs. Hadley was right. Della won the scholarship. Della went to the university, the first in her family to do so, the first on her whole street, a fact her mother announced to every single person who came within speaking distance. Della studied astrophysics, and she was good. She was not just good, she was the kind of good that made professors set down their chalk and turn around. She was the kind of good that got her name written on the small list of students who were quietly expected to go far. She was in her final year. She was 4 months. 4 months from her degree. And then life did what life so often does to the people who can least afford it. She fell in love. She fell in love the way young people do, completely and foolishly. And she found herself, in the spring of her final year, carrying a child. The young man was not unkind, but he was frightened. And frightened young men have a way of becoming distant young men, and distant young men have a way of becoming gone. Della went home to tell her family, certain, that they would help her find a way. She had 4 months left. 4 months. Surely between all of them, they could find a way for her to finish. She would remember that conversation for the rest of her life. She would remember the way her mother's face changed, the way the word disgrace was spoken, not shouted but worse, said quietly. The way you say a thing you have decided is simply true. She would remember being told that she had thrown it all away, that she had embarrassed them, that the scholarship money and the pride and the long drives and the books had all come to nothing. She would remember the door closing. And so Della, who was 4 months from a degree in astrophysics, who could calculate the path of a comet across the dark, who had been told by a weeping teacher in a parking lot that she would do something this world had never seen. Della left school. She got a job. She had her baby. She named him Marcus, after no one in particular, simply because it was a strong name, and she wanted him to have a strong start, since she could give him so little else. And she put the locket away. She raised him alone. There is no soft way to say what that costs a woman, and Della would not have wanted it said softly anyway. She worked. She worked the way water works against stone, without ceasing, without complaint, wearing down the impossible by sheer refusal to stop. She cleaned offices in the daytime when Marcus was small, and her own mother, in a grudging and never quite spoken reconciliation, watched the boy. Later, when he started school, she found the night work, because the night work paid more, and because it meant she could be there in the afternoons when he came home, even if she had to sleep in the mornings to do it. She never let him see the locket. That was a private thing, a thing for the quiet hours, and she would not have her son grow up believing his mother spent her nights mourning a life she might have had, instead of being grateful for the one she did. So Marcus grew up believing his mother was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman who cleaned buildings, who was tired, who loved him fiercely, and who checked his homework every single night, with an attention to detail that he found, frankly, a little intense for a woman who cleaned floors. "Mama, you don't have to check the math part," he told her once, around the age of 12, with the particular embarrassment of a boy who has begun to suspect his mother is not as worldly as his teachers. "You won't understand it." He did not say it to be cruel. He said it the way children say things, without knowing the weight of them. But Della remembered it. She remembered the small, surprised pain of it, and the way she had simply said, "Let me look anyway, baby," and then quietly corrected 3 errors he had missed. He never asked how she knew, and she never told him. That was the shape of their love. It was not a love of grand declarations. It was a love of corrected homework and packed lunches, and a single mother sitting up at the kitchen table at 5 in the morning, still in her work clothes, making sure her son had everything he needed for a day she would spend asleep. It was a love that asked for nothing and gave everything. And Marcus, like most children, did not fully understand it until he was much older. He grew up good. That is the thing Della was proudest of, the thing that made the whole long sacrifice worth it. He grew up kind and steady and decent, He did well in school. Not brilliantly, not the way she once had, but well, with hard work, which she told him mattered more anyway. He got into a state college. He studied engineering of all things. And if there was a particular ache in Della's heart at that choice, a particular bittersweetness in watching her son walk through doors that had been closed to her, she never showed it. She only smiled and said she was proud and meant it with her whole heart. By the winter our story turns to, Marcus was 22 and finishing his own final year, and he had landed, through his university's program, a coveted thing, an internship, a real one, a foot in the door at a place that took only the best. He had been placed at the very same NASA facility where his mother, unknown to him and unknown to nearly everyone, swept the 9th floor every single night. He did not know she worked there. She had never told him exactly where her building was. It was simply the office, a place she went to in the dark and came home from in the dark, and a 22-year-old with his own life and his own dreams had never thought to ask. And Della, when she learned where his internship would be, made a quiet and painful decision. She would not tell him either. She told herself it was to protect his pride. Let the boy walk through those famous doors as an intern, as a young man with a future, without the complication of his mother pushing a cart down the hall behind him. Let him have it clean. Let him have it whole. But if she was honest with herself, in the deepest quiet of the night, she knew there was another reason too. She did not want to see his face when he learned that the building of his dreams was the building of her labor. She did not want to find out whether he would be proud or whether he would be ashamed. So they worked in the same building, the mother and the son, separated by the cruel arithmetic of shifts. He came in the morning, bright and hopeful. She came at night, when he was already gone. For weeks they passed each other like two ships in the same dark harbor, never knowing the other was there. Until the night the numbers went wrong. The whole world was watching the spacecraft. It had a long technical name, but the public had taken to calling it the Wayfarer, and the name had stuck because it suited the thing it described. The Wayfarer had been traveling for years, launched before Marcus had even started college, out across the dark and silent reaches of the solar system toward a small, ancient asteroid that had never been visited by anything made by human hands. The asteroid mattered. The scientists said it was a relic, a fragment left over from the very birth of the solar system, unchanged for billions of years. To study it up close was to look back in time, to touch something older than the Earth itself. Nations had cooperated, fortunes had been spent, careers had been built and staked on the Wayfarer reaching its destination. And now, after years of travel, it was finally close. The mission had entered its most delicate phase, the approach. The spacecraft had to be guided into a precise window around the asteroid, a narrow corridor in the dark, governed by the faint tug of the asteroid's own slight gravity, by the push of the distant sun, by 100 forces so small that on Earth they would mean nothing, but out there, across millions of miles, meant the difference between a mission that made history and a mission that sailed past its target and into the empty dark forever. The margin for error was almost nothing. The engineers calculated and recalculated. The corrections had to be exact, transmitted to the spacecraft hours in advance because of the great distance, and then there was nothing to do but wait and watch and pray to whatever the people in that room prayed to. The team was exhausted. That is a detail that matters, and it is a detail that the history books, if they record this at all, will probably leave out. The approach phase had stretched on for weeks of round-the-clock work. The lead flight director had not slept properly in longer than he could remember. The engineers were running on coffee and adrenaline, and the particular fragile high of people who know the world is watching and cannot afford to fail. And exhausted people make mistakes. Even brilliant people, especially brilliant people, when they have been awake too long and have looked at the same numbers so many times that their eyes no longer truly see them. The mistake, when it came, was small. It was almost nothing. It was a single value, in a single line, in a long table of gravitational correction factors, and someone, somewhere in the chain of tired hands, had entered it with the wrong sign, a minus where there should have been a plus. It the kind of error that a fresh eye would catch in an instant and a tired eye would slide right past, 1,000 times over, never seeing it at all. It slid past all of them. It slid past the engineer who entered it, and the engineer who checked it, and the senior reviewer who signed off on it. It slid past the flight director, who trusted his team because his team was the best in the world. The correction, with its tiny poisoned error, was scheduled to be transmitted to the wayfarer at the start of the next day's shift, and if it were transmitted as written, the spacecraft would adjust its course by a fraction of a degree in exactly the wrong direction, and it would miss its narrow window, and years of work and a fortune of treasure, and the dreams of thousands of people would go drifting past the ancient asteroid and out into the dark, lost, forever. No one knew. They had all gone home, or to the cots in the back rooms, to grab what sleep they could before the morning. The great room on the 9th floor was empty, except, of course, for the woman with the cart. Della almost didn't see it. That is the thing she would think about, afterward, in the long stretch of nights that followed. She almost didn't see it. She was tired that night, more tired than usual, her back aching from a long week, her mind half on Marcus, who had seemed distant and worried on the phone, carrying some trouble at his new internship that he wouldn't talk about. She had finished the 9th floor. Her cart was loaded. She was, in fact, already turning toward the elevator, already thinking of her thermos and the long, quiet drive home. But the screen pulled at her, the way it always did, and she stopped, as she always stopped, for one last look at the wayfarer's numbers before she went home to sleep. She read the trajectory table the way she had read 1,000 others, and something in it snagged. She could not have said at first what it was. It was a feeling more than a thought, the way you know, walking into your own kitchen in the dark, that something has been moved, before you can say what. Something in the long column of correction values was wrong. It sat wrong. It read wrong. It was like a single sour note in a song she had heard 100 times. She set down the handle of her cart. She leaned in close to the great screen, close enough that the glow lit her tired face, and she traced the columns with one finger, the way Mrs. Hadley had taught her to do 30 years before. Read it slow. Read it like it matters, because it always does. And then she found it. The gravitational correction factor on the 3rd line. The sign was wrong. She stood very still. Her heart was beating in a way it had not beaten in 20 years. She told herself she was mistaken. She told herself she was a tired woman with a mop, and that the smartest people in the country had built this mission, and that the very idea that she had found an error they had all missed was the kind of foolish pride that gets a person laughed out of a building. But she could not unsee it. She worked it through in her head, standing there in the empty room at 3 in the morning, the way she used to work problems through in the back of a lecture hall a lifetime ago. If the sign was negative, the correction would push the spacecraft this way. And this way was wrong. This way led out, away, into the dark. The sign should be positive. She was nearly certain. She made herself check it a 3rd time, a 4th. She was as certain as she had ever been of anything. And then came the harder problem, the human one. What was she supposed to do? She was the night janitor. She had no badge that opened the doors of authority, no name anyone would recognize, no standing to walk into mission control in the morning and tell a room full of engineers and directors that she, the woman who emptied their bins, had found a mistake in their billion-dollar mission. They would not believe her. Worse, they might not even let her speak long enough to be disbelieved. They might simply have her escorted out, gently or not, and call her supervisor, and that would be the end of her job, the job that fed her son, the job that kept the roof over both their heads. She thought of all the reasons to say nothing. They were good reasons. They were the reasons of a sensible woman who had learned, over a long and difficult life, exactly how little the world wished to hear from someone like her. And then she thought of the spacecraft. She thought of it out there in the dark, traveling for years, carrying the hopes of thousands of people who would never know her name. She thought of how close it was. She thought of all that work, all that treasure, all those dreams, about to drift past their target and into the empty forever, because a tired hand had typed a minus where there should have been a plus, and because the only person who had seen it was a woman the world had decided did not count. And Della Mcorreaux made her choice. She would not march in. She would not make a scene. She would do the only thing a careful woman in her position could do. She found a pad of paper on the nearest desk and a pen, and in her neat, careful handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who had checked a child's homework 10,000 times, she wrote a note. Simple, quiet. A door left open rather than a door kicked in. Please check the sign on the gravitational correction factor, line 3 of the approach table. I believe it should be positive, not negative. I may be wrong. But please check it before you transmit. D. She read it over twice. She almost didn't sign it at all. In the end, she added only the single letter, the initial, because to sign her full name felt like too much, and to sign nothing felt like a coward's choice. She placed the note in the center of the lead flight director's desk, square in the middle of his keyboard, where he could not possibly miss it. And then Della Mcorreaux gathered her cart and rode the elevator down through the sleeping building and drove home through the dark to sleep, having no idea whether she had just saved a mission or thrown away her job, and certain, in her bones, that whatever happened next, no one would ever know it had been her. She was wrong about that, but not in the way she feared. The morning shift came in like the tide. The engineers arrived with their coffee and their tired eyes. The lights came up over mission control, the great screens brightened, and the long, careful machinery of the day's work began to turn. The transmission to the wayfarer was scheduled for late morning. There was time, but not much. The corrections had been finalized the night before. All that remained was the final checks, the procedural confirmations, the last quiet rituals before a team sends its commands out across millions of miles of nothing. The lead flight director was a man named Mcorreaux. He was 58 years old, and he had given his entire life to this work. And he was so tired that morning that he had to read his own coffee cup twice to be sure it was his. He sat down heavily at his desk, the desk at the center of the room, the desk from which he had directed missions for longer than some of his engineers had been alive. And he found the note. He almost swept it aside. That is worth saying plainly, because it is the kind of small moment on which large things turn. Mcorreaux, exhausted, with 1,000 things to do, looked at a handwritten note sitting on his keyboard, and very nearly crumpled it without reading it, assuming it to be some message left by the cleaning crew about a broken light or a clogged sink. But his eye caught a word, gravitational, and then another, transmit. He stopped. He picked up the note. He read it. He read it again. For a long moment, Mcorreaux sat very still, holding a piece of paper in a hand that was not entirely steady, because here was the thing that no one in that room knew yet, the thing that made the note land in his chest like a stone. He had risen through this work the hard way. He had been, once, a young man whom no one expected much from, a young man whose ideas were dismissed in rooms like this one, because he did not look or sound like what the people in charge expected genius to look and sound like. He had learned, in a long and difficult career, that the most dangerous words in any room full of brilliant people were "we already checked it," and he had made himself a quiet promise, decades ago, that he would never be the man who waved away a warning simply because of who it came from. So he did not wave it away. He called over the nearest engineer, a young man, sharp and eager, one of the bright new ones, and he handed him the note, and he said, simply, "Check this, right now, before anything else. Check the sign on the gravitational correction, line 3, show your work." The young engineer blinked at the handwritten note. "Where did this come from?" "Just check it," Mcorreaux said. And the young man went to check it. He sat down at his terminal, a little annoyed, frankly, because he was certain, that the corrections had been verified 3 times over, and he was being asked to chase down a note that someone had left, like a message in a bottle. He pulled up the approach table. He found line 3. He looked at the gravitational correction factor and its sign, and he began, with the slight impatience of youth, to work through the math to prove the note wrong. And then, the color drained out of his face. He did it again, faster, his fingers flying. He pulled up the source data. He traced the value back through the chain. He checked it against the model, against the physics, against the cold and unarguable truth of the numbers. The note was right. The sign was wrong. A minus where there should have been a plus. The correction, as written, as scheduled to be transmitted in less than 2 hours, would have pushed the wayfarer in exactly the wrong direction, by exactly enough to send it sailing past the asteroid and out into the dark, lost, after all those years and all that work, forever. The young engineer stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the desk behind him, and he said the words that would echo in that room for the rest of all their lives. He did not mean to shout, but he shouted. Stop. Stop everything. The correction's wrong. Line 3 is wrong. Somebody pull the transmission. Do not send it. The numbers are wrong and this note is right. The room went silent. 40 people, in an instant, went still. And then it became the kind of controlled, urgent chaos that those rooms are built for. The transmission was halted. The correction was pulled. The senior team gathered around the young engineer's terminal, and they checked, and checked again, and there could be no doubt. The error was real, and it had nearly cost them everything, and it had been caught, with not 2 hours to spare, because of a handwritten note left on a desk in the middle of the night. When the immediate crisis had passed, when the corrected value had been verified and re-verified, and the proper transmission prepared, Raymond Okafor held up the note in his hand, and he asked the question that would change a woman's life. Who wrote this? Who is D? No one knew. They thought it was one of their own at first. It seemed the only reasonable explanation. Someone on the team, some engineer working late, some analyst who had spotted the error and, for reasons of their own, chosen to leave a quiet anonymous note rather than raise an alarm. They went looking for the author with a kind of grateful urgency, wanting to thank whoever it was, wanting to understand why they had not simply spoken up. But the search came up empty. No one on the engineering team had written it, no one on the analysis team. They checked the handwriting against the night logs, against sign-in sheets, against the careful records that a facility like that keeps. The note matched no engineer, no analyst, no scientist, no one whose name appeared on any roster of the people authorized to be in that room. It was Earl, the night security guard, who finally solved it. Raymond Okafor, growing more puzzled and more determined by the hour, had pulled the access logs for the 9th floor, who had badged in, who had badged out, in the dead hours when the note must have been written, and the logs showed almost no one. The floor had been empty. The team had gone home. The only person who had been on the 9th floor between 2 and 4 in the morning, the only person who had ridden the elevator up and ridden it down again, was a member of the custodial staff. "That's Della," Earl said when they asked him. He said it with a warmth that surprised them, the warmth of a man speaking of a friend. "Della Mcorreaux. She does 9 every night. Best of the bunch, that one. Why? She in some kind of trouble?" There was a silence in the room when Earl said the name. A silence in which 40 of the smartest people in the country slowly understood that the note that had saved their mission, the note written in a careful and educated hand, the note whose author had clearly understood the physics of a gravitational correction well enough to catch an error that they themselves had missed, that note had been written by the woman who cleaned their floors. Some of them did not believe it. That is the truth, and it should be told. Some of them, even then, even holding the proof in their hands, found it easier to believe in a strange coincidence, a lucky guess, a janitor who had somehow stumbled onto the right answer by accident, than to believe that the woman with the cart understood their work. The mind protects itself. It is a hard thing to look at a person you have walked past 1,000 times without seeing, and to understand that you were the blind one all along. But Raymond Okafor did not need convincing. He had read the note. "I may be wrong, but please check it before you transmit." Those were not the words of a lucky guesser. Those were the words of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at, and who had also known, with painful precision, exactly how little chance they had of being believed. He recognized that voice. He had spent his whole life being that voice. "I want to meet her," he said. Della knew something was wrong the moment she came in the next night. She came in the way she always did, badging through the side entrance at the start of her shift, nodding to Patrice at the desk. But Patrice did not nod back in the usual way. Patrice looked at her with wide eyes and an expression Della could not read, and said, "They're looking for you. Upstairs. The day people lay. Left word. You're to go up to 9 the minute you got in." Della's heart turned to cold water in her chest. So that was it then. They had found the note. They had traced it to her, and now they were going to do what she had feared from the beginning. Call her in, Ask her how she dared, and let her go. She walked to the elevator with the slow, steady steps of a woman walking toward a thing she cannot avoid. She thought about Marcus. She thought about the rent. She thought about how she would explain it to him, that she had lost the job because she had stuck her nose where it did not belong, because she had not been able to leave the numbers alone. The elevator rose. The doors opened on the 9th floor, and the room was full of people. It was not full the way she had feared, not full of stern faces and security, and the cold machinery of dismissal. It was full of engineers and analysts and a tall, tired-looking older man standing at the center of it all. And when the elevator doors opened and Della stepped out in her custodial uniform, every single person in that room turned to look at her, and the room went quiet. Della stopped. She did not know what to do with her hands. She was aware, suddenly and painfully, of the cart she had left downstairs, of the uniform she wore, of the great gulf between herself and every person in that room. The tall, older man stepped forward. He was holding something in his hand. It was her note. "Are you Della Mcorreaux?" he asked. His voice was gentle. "Yes, sir," she said. Her own voice came out smaller than she wanted. "If this is about the note, I didn't mean any harm by it. I know it wasn't my place. I just saw the sign was wrong, and I couldn't just leave it. I'm sorry if I overstepped. I'll clear out my locker if that's—" "Mrs. Mcorreaux," Raymond Okafor said, and something in the way he said it stopped her. "You didn't overstep. You saved this mission." The room was very quiet. "In 2 hours we would have transmitted that correction," he went on, "and the Wayfarer would have missed its window. Years of work. Everything. Gone. And not one of us in this room caught it." He looked down at the note in his hand, then back up at her. "You did. So I have to ask you something, and I want you to know there is no wrong answer, and you are not in any kind of trouble." He paused. "How did you see it?" And here was the moment. Here was the door, standing open, after 20 years. Della could have given a small answer. She could have said she'd gotten lucky, that she'd just noticed something looked off, that she didn't really understand the science. It would have been the safe answer, the humble answer, the answer that asked for nothing and kept her in her place. Part of her wanted to give it. Part of her had been giving it, in one form or another, for 2 decades. But she looked at the note in his hand, her own careful handwriting, the words she had written in the dark when she thought no one would ever know, and she looked at the great screen behind them, full of the language she had loved before she had loved anything but her son. And something in her, some ember that 20 years of quiet hours had never quite let go cold, caught fire. "The correction factor accounts for the gravitational influence on the approach," Della said, and her voice, as she spoke, grew steadier with every word, the way a singer's voice steadies once the first note is safely sung. "With the sign negative, the adjustment pushes the spacecraft outward, away from the capture window. But the geometry of the approach requires the opposite. The asteroid's pull is small, but at that distance and that velocity, a fraction of a degree compounds. By the time it reached the window, the spacecraft would have been thousands of miles off. It would have sailed right past." She stopped. She looked at the tired, astonished faces around her. The sign had to be positive. There wasn't any other answer. "I checked it 4 times because I couldn't believe nobody else had caught it. I thought I had to be the one who was wrong." There was a silence in that room that Della would remember for the rest of her life. And then Raymond Okafor did something she did not expect. He smiled. A slow, wondering smile. The smile of a man who has just watched the world turn out to be larger and stranger and better than he had believed. "Where," he said quietly, "did you learn to talk like that?" And so Della Mcorreaux, standing in her custodial uniform in the middle of mission control, told them. She told them about the girl on the sagging porch street and the teacher who wept in the parking lot. She told them about the scholarship and the university and the final year. She told them, without bitterness, simply, the way you tell a thing that happened a long time ago to someone you used to be, about the 4 months, and the door that closed, and the locket she had put away. When she finished, no one in that room was looking at a janitor anymore. They did not let her go back to the cart. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen by magic. There were conversations, and there was paperwork, and there were people in distant offices who had to be convinced. But Raymond Okafor, who had spent his whole life learning how easily the world wastes the people it refuses to see, made it his personal mission that this particular waste would be undone. The university was contacted. The records were pulled, and there they were, after all those years, the record of a brilliant young student 4 months from a degree, with the highest marks her professors had given in a generation. A path was found. It was not simple and it was not instant, but it was real. A way for Della to complete the degree she had been forced to abandon, with support, with the credits she had already earned counting toward the whole, and alongside it, an offer that made her sit down hard in her chair when she heard it. A place at the facility. A real position. An entry into the work. Late. Far later than anyone would have planned. Surrounded by colleagues young enough to be her children. She was 46 years old. She would be starting a career that most people start at 22. There would be those who whispered. There would be hard days. Days when the youth around her moved faster. Days when she had to learn the new tools and the new methods and swallow her pride, and ask a person half her age to show her how a thing was done. But she would be doing it. After 20 years of quiet hours, after 20 years of taking the locket out only in the dark, she would be living in the language she loved, in the daylight, with her name on the door. Mrs. Pearline Hadley had been right after all. It had only taken 30 years and a note left on a desk in the middle of the night. You are going to do something this world has never seen. But the part of the story that mattered most to Della, the part she would hold closest, the part that would make the whole long road worth every single step, had not happened yet, because she still had not told Marcus. He found out by accident, or perhaps not by accident at all. Perhaps some things are simply meant to come to light in their own time. The story of the saved mission had spread through the facility, in the way such stories do, told and retold in the break rooms and the hallways, growing a little in each telling. The janitor who had caught the error the engineers missed, the note left in the night, the woman with the secret education who had been hiding in plain sight all along. It was the kind of story people could not help repeating, because it was the kind of story everyone wishes were true, and so rarely is. Marcus, the young intern, heard it like everyone else. He heard it in the break room, from another intern, who told it with relish. "Did you hear about the cleaning lady who saved the wayfarer?" And Marcus laughed and shook his head, and said it sounded like an urban legend, the kind of too-good-to-be-true story that goes around a workplace. "No, it's real," the other intern insisted. "It's all anybody's talking about. They're giving her a job and everything. Some lady who used to study physics or something, dropped out years ago, been cleaning floors here at night. Mcorreaux, I think the name was." And the world went silent around Marcus. Mcorreaux. It is not a common name. He had spent his whole life being the only Mcorreaux anyone he met had ever heard of. He had spent his whole life with that name, his mother's name, the name she had given him because she wanted him to have a strong start when she could give him so little else. "What did you say her name was?" Marcus asked. His voice did not sound like his own. "Mcorreaux, Della Mcorreaux. Why, you know her?" Marcus did not answer. He could not answer. He was somewhere very far away, 12 years old again, at a kitchen table, saying to his mother, "You don't have to check the math part, you won't understand it." He was every afternoon he had come home to a tired woman who never told him where she worked. He was every night she had sat up in her work clothes at 5 in the morning making sure his homework was right, with an attention to detail he had never once thought to question. "You won't understand it." His mother. His mother had been 4 months from a degree in astrophysics. His mother had been cleaning the floors of the building of his dreams, in the dark, every night, while he walked its halls in the daylight as an intern and never knew. His mother had caught an error that a room full of engineers had missed in a language he had spent his whole life believing she could not possibly speak. His mother had given it all up, for him. They let the family be there for the approach. It was Raymond Okafor's doing, when he learned, and the whole facility learned it together, in a single astonished afternoon, that the young intern Marcus was Della's son, that the mother and the son had been working in the same building for weeks without either one knowing. He understood at once that he was holding in his hands not just a moment of science, but a moment of something older and deeper than science, and he was not a man to let such a moment pass unmarked. So on the night the Wayfarer finally made its approach, the night it would either slip into its narrow window around the ancient asteroid or sail past it into the dark, the great room on the 9th floor was full of the engineers and the analysts and the scientists who had given years of their lives to this, full of the tension that fills such rooms when everything hangs on numbers transmitted hours before, when there is nothing left to do but wait and watch and trust that the work was right. And in that room, near the back, in a custodial uniform she had insisted on wearing one last time, because, she said, she wanted to be standing in it when the thing was done, so she would always remember exactly where she had come from, stood Della Mcorreaux. Marcus stood beside her. He had not let go of her since he found her. That was the truth of it. When he had finally tracked her down, when he had finally stood in front of her and asked her, in a broken voice, whether it was true, all of it, the physics, the degree, the years of secret labor in the building of his dreams, she had simply looked at him with the steady, loving eyes he had known his whole life, and she had said, "Let me look anyway, baby." And he had understood, all at once, everything she had never said, and he had wept like a child in his mother's arms. Now they stood together and watched the screen. The room counted down the long minutes. The signal from the Wayfarer took time to cross the vast, dark distance, so that what they watched was already the past, already decided, the spacecraft having done whatever it had done while they sat helpless and waiting to learn it. The data crawled in across the millions of miles. The engineers watched their monitors. Raymond Okafor stood at the center of the room with his arms folded and his jaw tight. And then the numbers resolved on the great screen, the approach trajectory, the capture window, the position of the spacecraft within it. The Wayfarer had threaded the needle. It had slipped into its narrow window around the ancient asteroid, exactly as it was supposed to, exactly along the corrected path, the path that ran through a single value on a single line, a gravitational correction factor whose sign was positive, because a woman with a mop had stood in this very room in the middle of the night and refused to leave the numbers alone. The room erupted. There were cheers and there were tears, and there was the particular joy of people who have given years of their lives to a thing and watched it come true. Strangers embraced strangers. Engineers who had not slept properly in weeks laughed and wept at the same time. The years of work, the fortune spent, the dreams staked, all of it had reached its target, out there in the dark, where no human hand had ever reached before. But Della was not watching the screen anymore. She was watching her son. Marcus stood with his eyes fixed on the great screen and on the name that appeared there. Because Raymond Okafor had insisted on that too. When the mission's records were finalized, when the official account was written of how a near-fatal error had been caught with 2 hours to spare, the name of the person who caught it was entered into the record, not as an anonymous note, not as a member of the custodial staff, by name, Della Mcorreaux. There, on the screen, among the names of the people who had made this night possible, in the place that history would keep. Marcus looked at his mother's name on the screen in mission control, and he did not know that she was watching him. He thought she was watching the screen, like everyone else, and so he said what he said, the way a person says a thing they believe is private, quietly, to the young engineer standing next to him, in a voice thick with something he could barely hold. "That's my mother," he said. The engineer turned, surprised. "That's my whole life," Marcus said, and his voice broke on the words. "I thought she gave up her dream for me. I thought she traded it away. I used to feel so guilty, that she cleaned floors so I could go to school. I thought I cost her everything she ever wanted to be." He shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the name on the screen. But she never gave it up. She never lost it. She kept it. All those years. She kept it folded up inside her, in the dark, and nobody knew, and she never said a word. He drew a breath that shook. She didn't trade her dream away for me. She carried it the whole time. She was waiting. She was waiting for one night when it mattered enough to take it back out. And when that night came, she saved this whole thing. She saved all of it. He pressed his hand to his mouth for a moment, and then he said the thing that Della would carry in her heart for the rest of her days, the thing she had waited 20 years to hear, without ever once letting herself hope she would. "I always thought my mother gave up the stars for me," Marcus said. "I was wrong. She held on to them the whole time. She just never let me see, because she didn't want me to feel the weight of it. And tonight, she reached up and put a spacecraft exactly where it was supposed to be. My mother did that, the woman who swept floor 9. And then he felt the hand on his shoulder, and he turned, and his mother was standing there. She had heard every word. She did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. She only looked at her son, this good, kind, decent young man she had raised alone, who had grown up steady and strong, who had walked through the doors she could not walk through, and had carried, all this time, a guilt she had never wanted him to carry. She looked at him with 20 years of love, and 20 years of silence, and 20 years of quiet hours in the dark, and she reached up, with a hand that still bore the calluses of 2 decades of labor, and she touched his face. "I never minded, baby," she said softly. "Not for one single day. You were never the dream I gave up." She smiled, and her eyes were shining. "You were the one I kept." The story spread, of course. Stories like that always do. It traveled out of the facility and into the wider world, the way the best true stories do, passed from person to person, because people need to hear, every now and then, that the world can still surprise you. The woman who swept the floors and saved the mission. The mother and the son in the same building, neither knowing. The dream that was never given up, only carried, folded up in the dark, until the night it was needed. People made much of it. There were the inevitable interviews, the inevitable articles, the inevitable strangers who wanted to shake Della's hand. She bore all of it with the same steady grace with which she had borne everything else, and she always said the same thing when people called her a hero. She said she had only done what anyone would do, which was not quite true, but was the kind of thing that true heroes always say. And she always mentioned a teacher named Mrs. Pearline Hadley, who had once wept in a parking lot and told a girl from a sagging porch street that she would someday do something this world had never seen. She finished her degree. It took time, the way all good things do, but she finished it. 4 months of coursework that had waited 20 years for her to come back and claim them. And on the day she walked across the stage to receive the thing that had been taken from her 2 decades before, there was a young man in the audience, on his feet before anyone else, cheering so loudly that the people around him turned to look. Marcus, her son, the one she kept. He had learned, by then, the thing that takes most of us a lifetime to learn, and that some of us never learn at all. That the people who love us most are often carrying far more than they ever let us see, and that the quiet sacrifices, the corrected homework, the packed lunches, the dream folded up and put away so that a child might have a start, are the great heroisms of the world, the ones the history books leave out, the ones that hold everything else up the way gravity holds up the stars. And he had learned to see. That was the real gift his mother had given him, in the end. Not the start she had bought him with her labor, though that mattered, but this, the knowledge that you must look at people, really look. The woman with the mop, the man with the broom, the tired person at the edge of the room whose name no one has bothered to learn. Because you never know, you simply never know, what dream they might be carrying, folded up in the dark, waiting for the one night it will matter enough to take it back out. Della Mcorreaux went to work in the daylight after that, in the building she had once cleaned in the dark, in the language she had loved before she loved anything but her son. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the others had gone home and the great room grew quiet, and the screens hummed their familiar hum, she would stop in front of the central display and look up at the numbers, the way she had for 20 years. But she did not have to hide it anymore. She did not have to wait for the quiet hours, or take her gift out only in secret, or put it away again before anyone could see. She just stood there, a woman who had been told to keep her dreams small, looking up at a spacecraft she had set on its proper course, somewhere out there in the dark. And she was, at last, exactly where she had always belonged. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone in your own life who carried more than they ever let you see, take a moment today to really look at the quiet people around you, the ones holding the broom, the ones at the edge of the room. You never know what stars they might be carrying, folded up in the dark, waiting for the night it matters enough to take them back out.